In this video, we are going through 3 modulation examples that are easy to follow for beginners. Don't forget to stay to the end of the video for a bonus example, and we're starting right now. Example 1. Modulating to dominant. Let's assume that you started in the key of C major. One of the most common modulation for this key is to G major, its dominant key. I will first establish the original key by having some simple chord progression. This can be anything, but in my example, I went from chord 1 to 2/7 to chord 7 before resolving to chord 1. Do note that inversions can be used, but for the purpose of explaining modulation, we are going to ignore them for now. Remember that I said a modulation process will likely start with a pivot chord. This C major chord highlighted in blue is the pivot chord here. It is chord 1 in C major and chord 4 in G major. Once a pivot chord has been identified, we can go straight into chord 5 of the new key. Since we are going to the key of G major, its dominant should be D major. We call this the secondary dominant. In my example here, you see that I've expanded the dominant into a dominant 7th, which works even better for the modulation. The Roman numerals used for this chord is 5, 7, or 5 from the key of C major, because this is not C major's dominant, but G major's, and G major happens to be C major's dominant. If you're still unsure about this, I've explained this clearly in my previous video, and you can watch it by clicking on the card here. The chord highlighted in red is the new tonic, and is of course the G major chord itself. Note how the new leading tone, F sharp, resolves to G. This resolution completes the modulation to G major. The chords that follow after the new tonic are chords that belong to G major, so we consider this a modulation to the dominant key. Any chord progressions in G major can now be used, but use a simple 2, 5, 7 to 1 to again strengthen G major's position as the new key. Example 2, modulating to subdominant. Again, we started in the key of C major. To modulate to the subdominant key, we have to get to F major. I will first establish the original key by having some simple chord progression, which is exactly the same as the previous example. Remember the 3 ingredients needed? We need to find a pivot chord first. In this case, the tonic of C major happens to be the dominant of F major, and this chord can act as both the pivot and the secondary dominant that can somewhat help us modulate too, but is less convincing. To make the modulation more convincing, I use a dominant 7 again with a chromatic B flat note that really hints at F major. The Roman numerals used for this chord is 5, 7, or 4 from the key of C major, because again this is not C major's dominant 7, but F major's, and F major happens to be C major's subdominant. And yes, this means that secondary dominants are not always 5 or 5, but can be 5 of whichever key you want to modulate towards. The chord highlighted in red is the new tonic, and is of course the F major chord itself. Note how the new leading tone E resolves to F, and the tendency note B flat resolves downwards to A. The chords that follow after the new tonic are chords that belong to F major, so we consider this a modulation to the subdominant key. Any chord progressions in F major can now be used by the use of simple 2, 5, 7 to 1 to again strengthen F major's position. You can also see clearly that the appearance of B flat notes solidify the modulation and helps us identify that we have modulated to F major. Example 3, modulating to relative minor. Modulating to relative keys is easy because they share a lot of common notes. Assuming we started in C major, we now have to get to A minor, that is also the submedian chord. I will first establish the original key by having a simple chord progression. Now there are many pivot chords between C major and A minor. In fact, if I construct chords using the A natural minor scale, all 7 chords can be pivot chords. However, we normally use the harmonic minor to construct chords, so some chords like chord 5 and 7 of A minor cannot be pivot chords. Here I chose a D minor as my pivot chord. This is chord 2 in C major and chord 4 in A minor. The next chord I highlighted in yellow is the secondary dominant, and I used an E dominant 7th in this case. I labeled it as 5, 7, or 6 in C major because it is not C major's dominant, but A minor's. But from A minor's perspective, it is simply a 5, 7. The next chord highlighted in red is the new tonic, which is of course the A minor chord itself. The chords that follow after the new tonic are chords that belong to A minor, so we have modulated to the relative minor key successfully. Hey guys, my name is Kenneth and I help music teachers and students with everything related to ABRSM music theory. If you found my content helpful, hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel so you don't miss out on any of my videos. Since you're still here with us, I'm going to give you a bonus example. Bonus: tonicizing instead of modulating. In our previous video, we also spoke about the difference between modulation and tonicization. So if you chose to only tonicize a chord instead of modulating there for a longer period of time, you would have to revert back to the original key after the new tonic. Here's an example. The pivot, secondary dominant, and new tonic chords are exactly the same as the previous example, which means that we have modulated to A minor. However, instead of continuing in the new key, I can look at the new tonic retrospectively as the submedian of the original key, therefore pivoting back to C major through 2, 5, 7, and 1. The perfect cadence at the end is important to re-establish C major as the returning key. In other words, if you just want to tonicize a chord, think of it not only as a new tonic, but as a pivot chord back to the original key. So there you go, 3 easy examples for you to start using modulation in your chord progressions. To summarize, modulate to the dominant, subdominant, and relative keys to start with. Dominant 7 chords can also be used in place of a dominant triad as a secondary dominant. For tonicization, pivot back to the original key using the new tonic, and have a perfect cadence in the original key to modulate back. If you're new to advanced music theory concepts, check out this video right here for more information.